Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Today at 1, we're live in Ukraine as Russia invades in a major military assault by land, sea and air.
It's now more than a month since the US Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan. China's ambassador to Australia also issued a blunt warning a few days ago that those who push for Taiwanese independence will be punished.
We're waiting for a peaceful reunification, but we cannot rule out other options.
You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed, it'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore.
This is why we fight. Democracy is at war. Across the world, we see the forces rallied against it. From the authoritarian regimes of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea to techno-aristocrats, religious fundamentalists, and populist demagogues. In the battlefields of Ukraine to the Straits of Taiwan and the halls of power in the United States, democratic, free values are under determined assault. But there are those who resist. They are activists, journalists, academics, soldiers, religious leaders, and politicians. In this series, we will meet those who claim to be fighting for a free world. We will find out who they are, how they're involved in the struggle, what democracy means to them, and why it's worth fighting for. In this episode of Why We Fight, we're meeting Dr. Alex Fergusson in Kyiv, Ukraine. He's a British Hong Konger and a boffin in the highest tradition. Having completed a PhD in composite materials, he set out to save the world from climate change with ultra-lightweight pallets for air freight. Then the Russians invaded Ukraine. Now his company FAC Techonology is dedicated to building the best combat drones that money can buy. These are killer robots, designed from the ground up for the Ukrainian armed forces to take the fight to their Russian enemy. Join me as we find out why he made this decision to move from green tech to defense tech. Dr. Fergusson, thank you for joining us very much indeed. Can you tell us a little about your background?
Yeah, so my educational background is bachelor's in engineering and material science from Imperial College, followed by a master's and PhD in composite materials from there as well, after which I started my company.
And what did your company do?
So the purpose of my company was essentially twofold. One, a colleague of mine, Professor Tony Kinloch, the god of glue as the FT call him, had explained how you could use nanoparticles or grow nanoparticles to make much more damage resistant and much more cost effective composite materials. But he'd only done that in an academic setting. So I thought maybe I could combine the fundamental physics he'd developed as well as with some manufacturing technology I had developed. And if we could industrialize that, then more damage resistant, more cost effective composite materials should be a good business case.
And I understand you aim to take that into green technology. What was that?
Yeah, so that was the objective, is, essentially make a more sustainable product, a more sustainable planet. So initially we were working on aerospace pallets. Not the most exciting thing in the world, but, a huge amount of global air freight travels on these aerospace pallets, and they weighed a lot. So the view that I had is, well, if we make a pallet which is half the weight, then you can either save a lot of fuel or put more product on an airplane, so need less flights. So very simple idea, but very complicated science behind it.
Okay. Well, now I understand you're involved in Ukraine's defense. We're sitting here in Kyiv. What is it that you do?
Simply put, we make killer robots with extra long range. So we make a range of kamikaze drones, bomber drones, reconnaissance drones, incorporating the lessons that we've learned from over a decade of working in aerospace and defense with these advanced materials.
And what are those lessons?
So the lesson specifically for drones is that if you can change, so anything that flies vibrates. If you can shift the frequency at which a drone vibrates higher, then the drone is going to spend less energy staying in the air and staying stable, which means you can use more energy to propel yourself towards a target. As a result of that, if it's a kamikaze drone, you can carry a payload much further, which improves the pilot's survivability. Alternatively, if you're in a drone racing world championship, it means your drone is more agile and accelerates better, which is why we won the first world championship we ever turned up at.
So let me understand, you, on this path, you decided to get involved in drone racing to see how your material would work?
Exactly. So I have friends who are fighting in the armed forces of Ukraine. I have friends who have died fighting for Ukraine. So if I was going to make a drone to help them in their mission, essentially to save freedom and democracy in Europe, I wanted to ensure that they had the best possible drone available. And to me, it seemed the logical way to test that was to get into drone racing to see, well, if our materials do make better drones, then that should be reflected on a drone racing course. And to get on its first outing, our drone won the first world championship it ever entered.
Wow, that's and it won that because of this material.
I mean, we had a very good pilot as well, but fundamentally, like, I'm playing fast and loose with the technology here. But essentially, if you can shift the way your drone vibrates to vibrate at a higher frequency, it will be more efficient, it will be more agile, it will accelerate better. I wanted to test that. Drone racing seemed the initial proving ground before I asked my friends in the armed forces of Ukraine, because I wouldn't want them to take risks unnecessary. So the idea is, if it's good at drone racing, maybe it should be good in combat. So the idea is, okay, we won the first world championship, it was entered in, let's have a go at combat. Because I have a level of confidence that I would ask my friends and not feel ashamed in them risking, frankly, their lives to test them in combat.
Okay. Now, how did you come to make this transition from green tech, pallets, logistics to weapons, essentially?
So I'm originally from Hong Kong. I'm a fifth generation Hong Konger on my mum's side. When I saw what China was doing to Hong Kong in 2019, I thought there is no way that the world will let freedom and democracy in a peaceful state fall. Naive, given that I actually spent time in Xinjiang and seen what they'd done to the Uyghurs. So I went back for a few days on the way to a business trip in Australia, put on a black shirt, stood on the front line for a few days, and obviously that didn't work out for us. So as a result of that experience, I have seen freedom and democracy be lost firsthand, and learnt a painful lesson that token gestures like turning up for a few days will not hold back, frankly, the evil in this world. So I am being more proactive now. Maybe it's a personal form of contrition for my failure to stand up adequately back then.
Your drones are weapons.
Correct.
How do you feel about your drones? Well, there's no two ways about it, killing people.
Well, they were designed with that singular intent. That is their purpose. So obviously that was a conscious decision on my behalf. It was also a long and challenging journey to turn my company around from a company saving the world from climate change to a company saving the world from Russians. But ultimately, that is the intent of the company. The company was founded on the principle that I want to leave the world a better place for my nephew, for my goddaughters, maybe for my own children someday. And because some days, if you're in engineering, you have bad days in any job. You have tough days, and when you get home and it's been a rough week, rough day, rough month, I want, when you have value, when you have purpose, that keeps you going, and helping protect an innocent country from a genocidal dictator is, frankly, what will get me out of bed in the morning on the worst of days after everything has gone wrong. And we have testing days where things have gone wrong. But we all get out of bed and we're all proud to go to work and do it because we know we are fighting to defend innocent civilians in a peaceful country from a genocidal invasion.
So about your experience in Hong Kong, you get off a flight on the way to work in Australia, you decide to stop over there, you join the protests in 2019. What was that experience like?
Well, I felt it seemed the right thing to do. I felt the time was right. It matched my schedule, but I'm a fifth generation Hong Konger on my mum's side. So it is my motherland. It is, in many ways, although I consider Britain my home, Hong Kong is also my home. And it was also actually, I regret to this day not staying longer, but when I was out there, you would see that it seemed like half of Hong Kong was out in the streets, but the other half of Hong Kong was still participating. Like you had Amars, back home making jerk, making food, making drinks. They were essentially doing our logistics. So it was a total effort from the Hong Kong people to demand that they retain their freedom. But we lost. And I think the reason that we lost is lack of international attention and pressure. So trying to learn from my mistakes, trying to be that international support that I think Ukraine needs, and which we as Hong Kongers did not get.
And what was your experience dealing with, and did you have any experience dealing with the authorities in Hong Kong during the protests?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was a black shirt, so we're the people on the front line. So the way it would work is we would, a path for a rally, a march would be filed, it would be accepted, and then the standard procedure from the authorities would be like, cancel the march, you can't do that march, you can only do this tiny little side march down the side street. So us as black shirts would go and walk the original march in full knowledge that the Chinese would send mafia and various other thugs in white shirts. That's why we wore black so we could easily identify each other, to attack us, and then we'd be tear gassed. At least that was when I was there. Later, there was guns and shooting and death, but not whilst I was participating. But yeah, I think it's people who live in freedom and democracy don't understand how the state can be used for violence against its own people until they've seen it.
So you've been in a scrap with the Chinese mob?
Yeah, they tear gassed us, hit us, and also when I left the country to go to Australia, I was pulled aside at the airport, put in a room for maybe 2.5 hours, and they released me from the room just before the flight left. I think they were clearly giving me a message.
What do you think that message was?
Stop fighting us, otherwise bad things are going to happen to you. Because that is what authoritarian gangster states do. They suppress those who stand up for freedom and democracy.
Your experience in Hong Kong, coming up against this, as you've described it, gangster state, were you ever afraid on the streets?
Yes, of course. Once again, I've mentioned my naivety about what the state would be prepared to do, despite having been to Xinjiang. I knew they were willing to use violence, but I was surrounded by millions of other Hong Kongers who were facing the same, if not far greater threat than me, because I could just leave and go home to safety in Britain. Whereas the Hong Kongers to the left and right of me, they had nowhere to go, but they were still out.
You've mentioned Xinjiang twice now. What was your experience there, and why did it mold you so much?
I was out there to do course setting for a company called Racing the Planet, who organise ultra marathons. I was out there, actually, me and my best friend had gone out to help assist them with that. But we also decided to make a holiday of it because we were, students, so we had long holidays from university. So we essentially just hired a local driver and a local translator, both Uyghurs. Cost hardly anything. Astonishingly beautiful country, astonishingly welcoming people. But after a few days with them, they kind of let their guard down and would talk about what was happening to their people and what had been done to them. And it is horrific. It can only be described as genocide. But they have to live amongst the Han Chinese people who are mostly there. There's a large military presence. You'll see that all of the officers are Han Chinese. You'll see that all of the privates, depending on the unit, are Han Chinese or basically Uyghurs who are used to just dig ditches. They're basically almost in slave labor. And when they point out these little nuances, then you start to think, okay, this is a veneer. Something is wrong here. And realizing that things can look not terrible on the surface, but the most atrocious activities are happening underneath was quite eye-opening. But I thought it can only happen here. It can't happen in somewhere like Hong Kong or elsewhere. But obviously I had been repeatedly wrong about the prevalence of genocide in the world.
You describe it as a genocide. It's been described in those terms before. How did that manifest in your eyes when you were there?
So I was only there for like a month. So I'd actually prefer to talk about it in the context of Hong Kong, if that's okay.
That's fine.
So in Hong Kong, the native dialect for Hong Kongers who've grown up there, been there for generations, is Cantonese. And most Hong Kongers are very proud of being Hong Kongers. They are, clear. They are maybe ethnically Chinese, but they are not Chinese. They are Hong Kongers. So in the lead up to the umbrella protests and then 2019, being told that Cantonese is not a real language, it's merely a dialect, that Hong Kongers are just confused about their identity. They're really actually just Chinese people speaking a primitive dialect, which is nonsense because Cantonese is a more elegant language than Mandarin. I could see that, okay, this is a staging ground. Because what they went for next was the educational system. Something that raised immediate alarms is that when foreigners came over to teach English or teach coding, technical skills to underprivileged kids as part of charities in Hong Kong, the rules changed in the past couple of years, saying essentially they had to abide by allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party. This is an old playbook. You deny the existence of an identity, you deny the existence of a separate culture, you deny that the language is representative of it, and then you get into the education system and you teach the generations to come that they are not Hong Kongers. Cantonese is not a language. They are Chinese people and they need to speak Mandarin as a result. This is a historical aberration. So it's the erasure of the identity of Hong Kongers. And, as the grandson of someone who fought for Hong Kong, for its freedom in World War II, that is something that is painful.
And that erasure of identity and that focus on language is something that we see in Russian language towards Ukraine and in Russian actions in the temporarily occupied areas.
Yes, absolutely. And I think people who've lost freedom or have seen the same playbook. So, for example, in Manchester, a lot of the main Ukrainian rallies are actually organized by a Hong Konger because we understand it. We don't understand it, we can empathize with it. We have seen being told that you're not a real culture, you're not a real people, you don't have a real language. So when Russia says that Ukrainians are actually just Russians and Ukrainian is a mere dialect rather than its own language, and they're not a people with their own culture and their history, that is something that, boils the blood of Hong Kongers. I also find it interesting that you see at the major Ukrainian rallies in London, you'll often see Tibetans turn out in numbers. And you'll see especially Iranians turn out in their thousands, to the point that you might mistake it as a women life freedom rally when it's not. It is Iranians turning out to support Ukrainians because they also understand in living memory what it is like to lose freedom.
Although that solidarity is heartening in a certain way.
It's heartening, but it's also sad it gets such little attention. Like, people who have lost freedom are screaming out for Ukraine, saying, we've lost it. We know how painful it is. Why aren't people fighting for Ukraine this time? You didn't fight for us. You didn't speak out for us. We know what happens. We don't want anyone else to go through that pain. That is why they come out to support Ukrainians. Why aren't more people listening?
Going back to Ukraine and your activities here, I understand that you're involved in an organization called the North Atlantic Fellows Organization, or NAFO. I understand it's quite complex, but could you do your best at describing what it is?
I will try my best. I have failed repeatedly to do this, but NAFO is very different to NATO. Because for a start, fundamentally, NATO is not at war with Russia, whereas NAFO is definitely at war with Russia. Now, when I refer to war, people think about Hollywood movies, Saving Private Ryan, etc. But the one area in this war where Russia is brutally effective is in the information warfare space. The reason for that is they are an authoritarian country where they can manipulate not only their own population, but will try and manipulate other populations. Whilst, we're in Kyiv at the moment, a democracy, or back in Britain, we don't have the state apparatus which is designed to indoctrinate the population. We do not have the tools, and as a result, we do not have the institutions which can fight back in this information warfare space. And Russia is very active, very successful here. So essentially, NAFO is a movement, a collective, probably about 200,000 individuals who devote their time to fighting Russian propaganda, debunking their disinformation, but also crowdfunding. So yes, we fight Russian propaganda in the information warfare space. Some of us fight in combat, not very many. Some of us have died in combat, not very many. But the main contribution we have in the kinetic aspect of the war is we fill in the gaps where state apparatus struggles. So at the start of the conflict, I was mostly focused on procuring decent underwear for soldiers. Like, that was my focus. I'm going to get the best value for money socks, and then coming into winter, thermal underwear. We're not fighting the battle at the front, but if we can arrange the logistics and the procurement and the rear, then that is also a large part of what NAFO does. And then we progressed into buying a load of kamikaze drones.
NAFO masquerade as cartoon Shiba Inus online on all the platforms, Twitter, I'm not going to call it X, TikTok, etc. There are people who say that this makes them unserious. What do you say to them?
That is the whole point. So the Russian apparatus for disinformation, misinformation, maintains a veneer of seriousness and formality, even though they are spouting absolute nonsense. So, calling all the Ukrainians are Nazis, President Zelensky's a dictator. This is just so ridiculous. But the initial response from NAFO will always be to ridicule it and make a mockery of it. So if you take away the credibility of the actors pumping it out, then that seems to have efficacy in turning people off paying attention to it. We have no organizational structure. Well, I suppose our organizational structure is anarchy, as opposed to Russian state apparatus, which is very much top-down in terms of organization. So the advantage that we have is that NAFO fellas will try all sorts of narratives, and eventually one will stick. And then we will then repeat and hammer home that narrative until it seems to stop working. So it's, in terms of propaganda war, it's an evolutionary process where you try various things and only the fittest messaging survives. And that is essentially how we combat the professional trolls and their bot farms from the Russian side.
There's the age-old method of humour and thumbing your nose at po-faced dictators.
Yes, but the thing is, I'm going to be honest, we're having a pretty tough time at the moment, but for significant periods since the full-scale invasion, it's had efficacy to the point that the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has thanked us for it. Lithuania gave us the Star of Diplomacy, the highest award for diplomatic merit, for essentially elite-level shitposting. It sounds bizarre, but me and some other fellows managed to goad General Surovikin, so-called, the butcher of Syria, into an online argument, and we got him banned. When Musk came on, he let him back on, but he no longer allows replies. So we've essentially muted that Russian propaganda voice. And this is supposedly big, scary Russia. And that is their common narrative, is that Russia is too big, too scary, and undefeatable. So don't bother fighting. It's just like, well, you lost a fight online to a bunch of cartoon dogs and now are afraid to be able to let us reply to you because you don't think you can take on cartoon dogs on the internet in the propaganda war.
Which just makes them even more ridiculous, doesn't it?
Exactly. And this is one of the narratives which has been continuous throughout this, is like there is no point in supporting Ukraine because Ukraine can't win because Russia is too big and powerful. That has been a consistent narrative throughout this, and it is very clearly nonsense.
Now, I believe Ukraine can win. To those who say Ukraine cannot win, what would you say?
Nonsense, for a start, is the immediate reaction. The question is, what will it cost for Ukraine to win? There is an expression you'll hear repeated by many fantastic generals who are great advocates for Ukraine, like General Hodges, General Petraeus, is that, war is a battle of will and logistics. There is no shortage of will on the Ukrainian side. So that leaves the question of the remaining part, which is the logistics, which is basically the bullets, the ammunition, the weapons, the drones. That is not on Ukraine to deliver. That is on Ukraine's allies. Russia is a far bigger state than Ukraine, with far more people, has huge amounts of oil and gas revenue because our sanctions are not as effective as they should be. But the Russian economy, compared to the EU plus Britain, is a joke. So the Ukrainians have the will. They don't have the domestic manufacturing capacity, but we as Europeans and Brits, we do. The question is, do we have the will? Because they will keep fighting on. You have seen it. There is no shortage of the will. The question is, how many of them need to get maimed or killed? And that, sadly for the Ukrainians, is largely out of their control, and it's in our government's control.
You're a British defence manufacturer, I think it's fair to say at this point.
Yes.
What is your experience dealing with the British government in trying to get weapons to Ukraine?
So Britain is definitely trying. I mean, obviously we have absolutely led the way. We showed incredible leadership at multiple points, and it's a source of pride to me that this is bipartisan in terms of delivering support. But also, yes, we supply our government and various others. I think they are aware that this war has redefined the way adaptation works. Like, if you just look at drones, 6 months ago, you were never having drones killing other drones in the sky. That just didn't exist. Whereas now you have entire units whose sole job is intercept other drones. This didn't exist. And now we have fiber optic guided drones. Like, the pace of development here is phenomenal. Like, things change on a month by month basis. The problem is, historically, the Western defense industry is not used to that. We're used to exquisite systems which take years to design, years to manufacture, and then when they require an update package, that will then take another couple of years. So the tempo of development is something that is completely foreign to essentially NATO complexes. They know it. They're trying to adapt, but they have a way to catch up when it comes to Ukraine. Yes, they are trying, but the system, I would say, if we had a peer-on-peer battle with Russia tomorrow, let's be honest, they've got 1.5 million men. How many troops does NATO have? Our procurement system would not be fit for purpose in basically making our troops survivable on the battlefield. Yes, they are trying, but we're not there yet, which is all the more reason why we need Ukraine to essentially be our shield, because at least initially, we're going to get wrecked.
In 2022, Ukraine wasn't there yet either. And we've seen the Ukrainian people themselves step forward, and people all over the world step up in a big way with these crowdfunding campaigns. How important are they to Ukrainian logistic efforts?
I mean, it's probably helped them hold a lot of territory and save a lot of lives. I would, just from my experience, I was buying drones for units through friends, but also fantastic NGOs like Zigazpor and charities like United 24. But if the Ukrainians have a lot of very smart people working for them, mathematicians, scientists. And one of the projects that Ukraine ran with NAFO was crowdfunding the initial batch of 250 kamikaze drones, which were all identical. Now you have to be like, well, there are people doing a couple of drones here, a couple of drones there. But actually, from a military science perspective, having 250 identical drones is actually very useful, because then you can go and test and measure the battlefield effect of identical systems amongst multiple units. That then allows you to update essentially your tactics. The naval drones, initially crowdfunded, they have basically defeated the Black Sea Fleet. So crowdfunded naval drones have pushed the Black Sea Fleet off from Ukraine and enabled the grain corridor to be reopened, and thus the vital economic supply to continue. Like the revenue, Ukraine is largely agricultural country, so having the cash flow in to keep the economy supported here is critical. But also it's beyond that, keeping grain flowing to the Middle East where there is instability, managed to keep populations there. Well, one, it's just the right thing to do to keep them alive, to keep them fed. But also when Ukraine is clamoring for attention, if their allies are being distracted because there's a food crisis in Africa or parts of the Middle East because the Ukraine corridor is closed, that is a strategic level threat, not just to Ukraine, but to all of us in the world. And the fact that crowdfunded drones have defeated the Black Sea Fleet, and delivered a strategic level effect, I think is pretty astonishing.
Do you think it's fair to describe it as a sort of democratic defense?
I mean, it's civil society defense. We in the opening days we all saw babushkas making Molotov cocktails. There was a teenage local celebrity skateboarder, like a 15-year-old who was doing fire correction missions for the Ukrainian army. So it was Ukrainian civil society, but not just that, it was Western civil society. Like, I was going around procuring thermal underwear and socks as fast as I could. I remember being in a space where there was a Ukrainian, Iron Bohi, is her handle. Unfortunately, her cousin died in combat fighting for Ukraine, as did her best friend. But you had these surreal spaces, like we would have literally voice calls on Twitter, and you had the former head of SEAL Team 6 who took out Osama bin Laden giving her advice on the best value for money night vision goggles she could get for her cousin's unit. It was utterly surreal, but yeah, I'd say it was civil society coming to defend democracy. And it wasn't just Ukraine, it was Ukraine and other people who have common values.
And what's wonderful about that to me is that it wasn't government initiated, it wasn't government led, it was just people doing it off of their own backs because they thought it was the right thing.
Yeah, that's correct. There are some people who genuinely believe in the values that we stand for freedom, for democracy, and are prepared to take action for it. Like, they're not necessarily going to fly a drone or shoot a gun, but there are many other activities that the warfighter needs to enable them to do their job. And, you know, I couldn't think of anyone better to advise on night vision goggles than Chuck Farrer. But in terms of what night vision goggles I should fundraise for my dad's unit.
And in a way, I mean, in a very significant way, that's what you do with your company.
Yeah, so, you know, we now manufacture kamikaze drones. The drones that are used currently by both sides are essentially repurposed toys, almost very sophisticated toys. But these drones were initially, you look at the standard 7, 8, and 10-inch drones both sides use. They were designed for hobbyists, whereas we design our drones specifically to kill.
What do you mean by 7, 8, and 10-inch?
I'm referring to the propeller diameter. So drones come in different sizes. The general terminology is we refer to drones by propeller size, because previously, when it was a consumer product, they were considered commoditized. A 7-inch drone is a 7-inch drone, but we have demonstrated that is not the case. Like our 5-inch drone, which we make with a company called 533 in America, turned up to its first World Championship, won. We have tested in front of NATO and friends our 20-inch drone, so 20-inch diameter propellers. A number of other companies had much larger diameter propeller drones. Our teeny tiny drone went further and carried more payload. So they are not actually commoditized. When a Western aerospace company designs a drone of a certain size propeller, hopefully it's not entirely surprising that it performs better than the one designed by a Chinese toy company.
Well, you touched on going further, carrying more payload. Those are going to be the important things for the drone pilot.
Yes. So the guiding philosophy, given that I have friends who are drone pilots in the armed forces of Ukraine, is lethality is great, but the number one priority is the pilot and his team are the most important thing. So keeping them alive is number one. And there are a couple of ways you can help keep them alive. But the easiest thing is be able to hit the enemy at a distance where they can't hit you back. So just range.
Anything else?
So the drones that we have a ground control station. So these are not flown by a hand control. These are a much more sophisticated setup. But that's not our technology. We essentially procure that from a Ukrainian company called Drone Space. And that has scrambling technology and a whole host of other features, which I will not talk about, which basically makes it very hard to identify where the pilot is taking off from and where he's operating from. So the idea is, and it also has incredibly long range. Yes, it's expensive, but it's got very high power communications, electronics. They just cost more. But the idea is, if the enemy can only hit you from 15 kilometers away, but you can hit them from 30 kilometers away, then you just sit further back and hit them when they can't hit you. If they encroach, retreat and just keep hitting them. But most importantly, stay alive.
And all of that to further Ukrainian democracy and Ukrainian freedom and protect it from Russian fascism.
Absolutely. I mean, I cannot think of a more clear example of good versus evil than the fight between Ukraine and genocidal Russian invaders.
What do the concepts of democracy and freedom mean to you?
So I will try and talk about this as essentially from a business and industrialist perspective. There's some great stuff which comes out of China. it's all knockoffs of things that were developed in Europe, Japan, or America. But that brings the question is, why is the best stuff designed in these countries? And yes, there are many good reasons. Like the Chinese people are, hardworking and able to follow procedure. But I pose that there is a very good reason why China does not make composite commercial airliners, and neither does Russia, because they wouldn't be cost competitive and they would be subject to unacceptable failure rates. And the reason for that is culture. There's a culture of, essentially, when you have a free and democratic society, you can speak out, you can raise your hand, you can raise the alarm. As a result of that, we are capable of developing products which make our lives better. We can go on holidays for cheaper. And yes, despite all of their advantages and basically limitless state funding, they are unable to compete in these really high-tech areas. And I wouldn't say people focus on the technology. I would say actually the culture is as important as the technology.
Well, to that end, you could compare the People's Republic of China with the Republic of China, also known as Taiwan. In their technological achievements, Taiwan seems to be leaps and bounds ahead, certainly in the CPU market.
Yeah, and there are many fantastic examples. So whether it's composite commercial airliners or Taiwanese semiconductors, or the Netherlands in terms of their lithography equipment to help make those semiconductors. When you are really trying to push the cutting edge of technology and manufacturing, you have to have a culture where people can, one, not be punished for mistakes as long as they are open about the mistakes and they disclose them as far as possible. Where you have a culture which is based on preserving face, based on cronyism, that catches up to you very quickly. Like, we have seen that on the battlefield. I remember seeing in the early stage of the war, seeing T-72s being hit by RPG-7s and getting killed. And amongst the sort of the academic community of people who have worked on armor, which I have done, but mostly funded by the US Office of Naval Research, we were just sat there going, that's impossible. How did that happen? But then at the same time, it is clearly possible because we're watching it happen in front of our eyes. Now, it turned out that the explosive reactive armor wasn't actually filled with explosives because someone had basically decided that it's going to be much cheaper to fill it with cardboard and I'll pocket the money. The steel didn't have the required heat treatment, which means it didn't have the yield strengths and fracture properties that it was supposed to have. So as a result, yeah, it looks like this big scary tank. They say it's big and scary, but actually you can just kill it with a 1960s weapon. And that is the problem. That is a cultural problem. When you can't trust in the product to deliver because people have a culture of essentially putting themselves before putting the product and the company first, even when that product is designed in a manner where its performance means life and death, literally.
So we've talked about the results of freedom and democracy from an industrialist's perspective. Is there anything sort of ethically exceptional about freedom and democracy in your eyes?
For me, it's I've witnessed. I did not understand the value of freedom and democracy until I saw it be lost in my motherland. Now, I'm lucky enough to also be a British citizen, so I live in freedom and democracy. But I feel how precious it is. I see Ukrainians fighting for it, and the fact that they have the will to keep on fighting, despite the fact that they will keep dying, that should be the message. There are people who are willing to die for this because they have had freedom and they understand what it is to lose it. It is precious, but it is fragile.
When polled in the United Kingdom, where we both live, democracy often polls poorly, especially among the younger generation. What would you say to those in the United Kingdom who don't quite understand the value of democracy and are perhaps somewhat apathetic?
I would ask why they are apathetic. Russia, China, the Islamic regime occupying Iran are incredibly effective in the information warfare space. They are actively targeting the youth in our country. So maybe this is a case actually to go old school. Ask your parents, ask your grandparents, why did previous generations fight? Why did they fight in World War II? Why did the few or the Battle of Britain get up in the air knowing there was an incredibly high chance they would not come back? It's hard to convey how valuable freedom is until you haven't had it. Like, imagine not being able to express your thoughts. Imagine not being able to choose who you love, how you love them. All of these basic things that we value. I mean, this is our TV, this is our story, how to live, how to love. Imagine not having a choice in that. Imagine your choices being made for you. Would you really accept that?
I don't think people would. And people here, where we're sitting in Ukraine, certainly are not accepting that proposal.
And that is why I go back to the point earlier. War is a battle of will and logistics. Ukrainians understand what they will lose if they lose freedom, because they understand that they will not be able to love who they choose to love, not be able to live how they want to live, not be able to raise their children in the way they want to raise them. They understand it. The logistics side of it, that is up to us. You maybe if you're not willing to fight, well, maybe you'll have to fight, but the alternative is, why don't we help the Ukrainians win so you don't have to fight?
For somebody in the United Kingdom or any of the other established democracies who's listening to this program, who wants to become involved but isn't quite sure what to do, what would you suggest?
First thing I would suggest is join NAFO. It's very, very simple. You can go to NAFO-offhand.org or NAFO.org, but then just start engaging. And the first thing I would suggest is find some Ukrainian voices. Start listening to Ukrainians. Follow Ukrainians on social media. Don't listen to the nonsense and the propaganda out there. Get it literally from not the horse's mouth, the Ukrainian's mouth. If you're interested, say you work for the NHS or you're in, otherwise a medical professional, maybe follow hospitallers or other medics. You will be able to relate with them. You can see how they live, how they fight, and potentially you can support them. Like, they might ask for things. It's like, hey, our truck got hit. We need some repairs, or we need new tires. Or if it's a drone unit, we could use a new power bank because they're flying so often, their batteries get trashed all the times. So you can see how they live, you can see how they fight, and then if you want to, you can engage with them and support them.
This has been Why We Fight. If you enjoyed the program, please consider subscribing to this show or financially supporting my work by following the Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee links below. For my written work and commentary, then check out my Substack, Dictators v Democrats. If you want to join a community of those who believe that democracy is worth fighting for, then feel free to join the Dictators v Democrats Discord server, which is also linked below. And remember, democracy is non-negotiable.